We asked storytellers to select a type of story and some words to inspire the stories that they tell.
Once upon a time, there was a fairy. This was the library fairy, and this library fairy, as you would expect, loved to read. This library fairy's name was Fiona, and Fiona would fly and flutter from library to library in the great big cities, in the tiny villages, because in every library she knew there would always be some treasure, whether it was an old favorite or something new, a dusty old book with maps in it, or an adventure story, or history, which actually is an adventure. Fiona always thought about how surprising it was that history was actually lives that people lived. And from our perspective, we think that history was inevitable, but it wasn't. It was all roiling and tumbling and unpredictable while people were living through it. But once it gets set down in a history book, it just seems so obvious, doesn't it? Fiona felt that way about kind of everything she read. Everything was a surprise, and she loved it. When she would fly from library to library, she would see a couple other library fairies, but there weren't many. They were going extinct, and she was excited whenever she saw one of them because they understood each other. They knew that what the other wanted was just to find a great book and a quiet corner and just to read undisturbed. They could support each other the best when they were at opposite sides of a room where they couldn't see the flicker of each other's shadows, but they could feel that feeling of concentration, engagement, being enthralled. One day, Fiona went to the smallest library you can ever imagine. It was the tiniest library. It was on a street corner. It looked like it was in a mailbox, and there were only 4 books. But they were great books. How did Fiona know this, and how do we know it? Well, whenever she happened to approach a great book, something would happen to her wings. It wasn't something she understood. It was something otherworldly. It was something from that deep fairy place of being. And her wings would start to flutter a little faster. They were shorter strokes, but it would keep her rising even higher. And as soon as she touched her finger to the spine of the book, she could feel it opening in front of her mind. She didn't have to open the pages. I mean, she loved to. There's nothing like cracking open an old book and smelling that smell, and even if you have a dust allergy, it's wonderful. But when it was a great book, she could just touch the spine, and it was like it all just went inside her head. It was like the cover of the book was a blanket, and it wrapped around her, and the story was inside of her. And in this tiny, teeny tiny little library with only 4 books on a street corner, Fiona saw that all 4 books were red, the color red. And they were read. They had been read by all the children in the neighborhood. One of the books had a leather cover and spine. One of them was a very old paper that was starting to crumble. One was linen, and one was velvet. Each one a different hue of red, each one a different thickness, a different state of being. Each one was imbued with the joy of the children who read them. That's what made them great. They were great because the authors put their heart and soul into it, but they were also great because when these children had read those books, they felt that heart and soul, and it gave them joy, and it gave them encouragement. When Fiona touched the book with the leather cover, this was an adventure story. It was swashbuckling. It was fun. It was vivid. It was alive. And she could feel that every child who read that book said, when I grow up, I'm going to have an adventure. It's going to be something that no one could ever imagine. No one in my family, no one in my community, no one who sees the world just as it is could imagine how we're going to change it. And all those children found their own way to make a difference in their community, in their country, in their world, or just in their family, in their home. But each one of them was so moved by that leather-bound adventure that they started to think maybe we shouldn't even use leather anymore. But that book did change them. When Fiona touched the red book with the crumbling paper cover, she felt all the feelings of all the children who read it. This was a history book. It was history and law, legislation, government. You'd think it would be boring, but it wasn't. It was about how over the centuries, the rights of people expand, and the government recognized those rights and said we can't deny them. And all those children who read that book about how people got the right to vote and they would no longer be enslaved, and society must make a place for them and must give them the opportunity and the power to grow their own lives, their own souls, to give them safety and comfort. All those children who read that book looked around their communities and said, wow, this world has changed a lot since that book was written, and there's still work we need to do. I'm so glad that I live in a world where people recognize that those rights are important, but there's still work to do to make sure that people don't forget or take them away, because history isn't inevitable and today isn't either. And when Fiona touched the book with the linen cover, she felt all the joy of all the children who had read it. This was a book about nature and mythology, and the way that in all these different societies, all these people had come up with ways to imagine why nature exists the way it does, why the sun and the moon move in the sky as they do, why the grasses grow and the trees, why we have seasons, why the water rushes. All of those questions that anyone who walks around in nature even for a minute or just opens the window thinks about, that every society tries to come up with a reason. And some are based on stories, and some are based on observations. And some of the people who come up with those have methodologies and procedures to figure it out. And actually everyone does, they're just different. And Fiona felt the joy of all the children who had read that book and who went out into the world wondering about how it developed the way it did. And those children, she knew, would become scientists and writers and people with great imagination and curiosity. And then finally she touched the book with a velvet spine, that red, deep, maroon almost, red. And she felt the joy of all the children who read that book. And this was a book about art and fashion and design and beauty. And what does beauty mean to us? Sometimes beauty feels like it's really just superficial, really just surface. But it does give people a sense of peace sometimes, or a sense of hope or joy. And curiosity about why something that just seems like it's on the surface can be so meaningful down below and have such an impact on our emotions. She felt the joy of all the children who read that book and who decided to become artists and designers, and to look at the beauty that already exists in the world that they inherited just by being born, and to make it even more beautiful. Fiona's wings were fluttering so fast and so short. And after touching all four spines, she pulled back. This tiny little library, only 4 books, had such a big impact on everyone who came in contact with it. Fiona flew around that little town, just that little neighborhood, 4-block radius even, right around that little library on the street corner, that little mailbox really. And she saw all these children who had read those books, all these adults who took their kids or their nieces and nephews, their sisters and brothers, who took every child that they knew to that little library. And she saw that all these people looked really calm, really peaceful. They had their emotions, and everyone had the thing that they wanted and needed. But she saw that when they interacted with each other, they listened. They tried. They tried to care about each other. All these people who had just read those 4 books in that little library. Fiona went back to the little library and she sat on top of that little mailbox looking thing. Most of the time, a library of fairy has to stay hidden, you know. There's a lot of fear that if people find out about fairies, they'll try to catch them. Like how people try to catch fireflies in a jar, and fairies don't want to be caught. They need to roam. But this was the first time that Fiona felt that it was safe for the people in this neighborhood to see her, because she knew that those people who had read all these 4 books, that they had curiosity and they had compassion and they had a desire to make the world more beautiful and bright and fair and honest and meaningful. That on these 4 blocks where those 4 books were read and where they were read, she could sit on top of that little library and she would be safe and she would have friends. Now Fiona still loved to travel around, but every so often when things got hard, she came back to that neighborhood and that library, and that felt like if a fairy could have a home in the human world, that would be her home. The end.